It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Piotr Kosicki, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of Maryland in Baltimore. Piotr graduated from the Department of History at Princeton in 2011, and even though I think his academic interests are pretty self-evident considering the title of this talk, I should really say that Piotr belongs to the generation of the most accomplished scholars, considering the subject of not just Polish Catholicism in the 20th century, particularly post-war Polish Catholicism in the 20th century, but also Western European Catholicism. Piotr is a leading specialist also when it comes actually to the Vatican II. And this is one of the upcoming publications. And speaking about upcoming publications, he's the author of the two books, which are going to be published in Poland, including the biography of former Prime Minister Tadeusz Mazowiecki. So, Piotr, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Please.
Thanks very much to all of you for coming. Thank you, Mikolaj, for the kind words, and it's nice to be here. It's funny when I think that we met 13 years ago for the first time, and it's nice to be able to do this. And I appreciate once again all of you having come here to hear me speak. I rarely deliver any kind of talks seated, so if you can't hear me at any point, please give a yell. What I want to do today is, over the course of the next 40 minutes or so, sketch out an intellectual framework for thinking about the livelihood of Tadeusz Mazowiecki, the late former Prime Minister of Poland, Prime Minister for 498 days, 1989 to 1991, in terms of his overall adult life, beginning in the mid-1940s, just after the end of the Second World War, and ending really in the mid-1990s. I in principle, will take it up until the end of his life, but really I'd prefer to leave that for Q&A if possible. In deference to the presidential elections that took place in Poland yesterday, I changed this slide at the last minute to reintroduce Mazowiecki's election poster from the 1999 presidential electoral campaign, which I think is probably the last time that so many Poles were shocked by the outcome of an election in the first round. But I wanted also to begin with a consideration as to how exactly we can think about Mazowiecki's identity as both an intellectual and a politician. One of my core thesis in this presentation and in the book itself about Mazowiecki that I'm in the course of preparing is that Mazowiecki consistently throughout his entire adult life pursued a fairly stable agenda of what he considered to be Catholic social teaching, the promotion thereof, in both social and political life. So whether we're talking about Poland in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, whether we're talking about the years of hard Stalinism, whether we're talking about 1968, 1980, or 1989, Mazowiecki's own understanding of the values and political goals that he was pursuing was fairly consistent. My basic argument is that this changed. His understanding never changed. His behavior changed in a very fundamental way in the 1980s that determined what I consider to be the justification for this subtitle here, The Life and Death of the Catholic Third Way, in the sense of explaining why it is that one of, certainly Eastern Europe, but really more generally Europe's leading Catholic intellectual activists and Catholic Third Way activists in particular for the 20th century writ large, at the time when he became Prime Minister in 1989 of really one of the most vibrant Catholic countries in all of Europe, decided not to pursue a political agenda anchored first and foremost in the Catholic Third Way ideas that he had been pursuing for the bulk of his adult life. I think that one scene is particularly telling of this. In November 1990, Mazowiecki, as Prime Minister, met with West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl in Budapest. Kohl proposed to Mazowiecki that Mazowiecki should formally enter, along with the structures, the political structures that he might organize in Poland, the Christian Democratic International within Europe, and Mazowiecki refused funding and organizational support with a line that he later was quite fond of repeating: "I'm a Christian and I'm a Democrat, but I am not a Christian Democrat." And I begin with this quote from Mazowiecki by way of planting seeds that I hope will germinate over the course of my talk, for explaining exactly how Mazowiecki did understand himself at that point. If there was a formal political classification with which he would identify himself by the time he actually became prime minister, or if simply he was moving according to circumstance and events. 1970, Mazowiecki was the then by 12-year editor of the left Catholic journal Więź, Bond in English. He explained in a book, an essay that was written explicitly for a book called Rozdroża I Wartości, why it was, broadly speaking, without referring to any specifics or choices that he or others had made in the 1950s, that within the first decade of the establishment of People's Poland, he and his closest colleagues had decided that Catholic social teaching and socialism could be reconciled. I'll explain what I mean in just a moment by Catholic social teaching, but I want to begin with his own words, because they think they do an excellent job of setting the agenda that we can trace throughout his own life. Our approach to socialism had as its starting point a moral motivation, right, a moral justification for socialism. We were attracted by the socialist tradition of social rebellion, or, to put it another way, by the social question, understood as the need for the transformation of society. We felt that the road to socialism would develop in such a way as to open up to personalist values. This idea of personalism is quite important in understanding Mazowiecki's intellectual and political trajectory, and I'll return to it in just a moment. This was the basis of our involvement and the standard by which we judge the unfolding events. Very important to understand that Mazowiecki was engaged in one form or another in Polish public life without interruption, essentially, from 1946 onward. And yet, the nature of his engagement changed on several occasions without a fundamental realignment of goals. The entire time, he believed that he was acting on behalf of resolving the social question, in the sense in which it is commonly understood by historians and social scientists looking at 19th and 20th century Europe, thinking about how to ameliorate the condition of the poorest of the poor, specifically the industrial proletariat brought about by the Industrial Revolution in Europe, how to normalize the state of industrial workers in an industrializing or industrialized society, and how to facilitate cross-class solidarity. And this is a vocabulary that he used well before he became involved in the establishment of the Solidarity movement in 1980. A little bit of an introduction to this vocabulary. So Mazowiecki used the phrase social question. It's a phrase commonly used by Catholic thinkers going back to late 19th century and early 20th century popes. Catholic social teaching, broadly defined from the standpoint of the Vatican, dates back to the 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum of New Things issued by Pope Leo XIII. Essentially, this is the beginning of a very wide range of different philosophical, social, political developments, and I'm not going to give, for lack of time, I don't want to go into too much depth with respect to what Catholic social teaching meant from the Vatican standpoint, but it's crucial to understand that that encyclical provided a long-term impetus for responses in Poland, as well as other places in Europe. Mikolaj mentioned in his introduction that I'm interested in Western Europe and in shifts in the Vatican too. I think that Mazowiecki, from really his late teenage years, was responding to trends that were European or transnational, or even by the time that the Iron Curtain had emerged, cross-Iron Curtain, well before we can talk about things like Polish-German reconciliation in the 1970s, or Mazowiecki's own travels abroad beginning in the early 1960s, when he became an MP within the Polish Communist Sejm. So, back to Catholic social teaching. The vocabulary of Catholic social teaching can get a little bit complicated and can seem a bit self-contradictory at times. Social Catholicism is the term sort of most traditionally associated with the set of social and political actions and activism rooted in the social teaching of the church that comes from the late 19th century. Catholic socialism, and you'll see that I provide this in quotes up here, is a phrase that actually became quite popular in certain circles in the late 1940s, early 1950s, among particularly the youngest generations of the movement Pax in Poland, which I'll come back to in a moment, for trying to explain the set of values being pursued. I think this is actually a very accurate description of Mazowiecki's own self-understanding of his political stance as of the late 1940s, early 1950s. We add to that later, in the 1960s, open Catholicism, or open-minded Catholicism, if you will, which is linked to the Catholic Church's own transformation in the context of the Second Vatican Council, which lasted from 1962 to 1965. The standard phrase used to describe those shifts is the Italian aggiornamento, updating. But the broad notion really is that what had long persisted as an agenda within the church of integrating the poorest of the poor, of bringing workers into cross-class solidarity with intellectuals and other Catholic activists, now was transforming and shifting toward a broader set of notions representing dialogue. Or, and if you look at the last point, we're back to personalism, respect for the dignity of the human person. This phraseology best identified, particularly outside Catholic philosophy, with the writings of Pope John Paul II, but it's phrasing that dates to the late 19th century. And that was actually quite popular even among many of the Catholic philosophers in Poland who contributed to the founding in 1918 of the Catholic University of Lublin. There was nothing new about this phrasing by the time that Mazowiecki picked it up in his first published writings in 1948, 1949, and 1950. Now, there's a bit of a dilemma that we have to... I'll skip this slide just for want of time, but I can return to it later on if you want to discuss more what the social question represented specifically. There's a dilemma when we're discussing how to toe the line between Catholic social teaching and the intellectual and political frameworks. Oh, dear. Okay. Yeah. Hopefully this will work.
Okay.
There we go. All right. Of socialism in its various forms. Specifically, the Catholic Church has been entirely consistent in its absolutely uncompromising condemnations of any kind of Catholic collaboration, certainly with communism, but even with socialism, since the mid-19th century. We begin with the writings of Pope Pius IX in the 1860s, even the 1840s. Rerum Novarum, very clear on the evils of socialism. 40 years later, Quadragesimo Anno, Pope Pius XI restates quite clearly, socialism no. 6 years later, he is very specific about quote-unquote atheistic and Bolshevistic communism as the sort of the apogee of the evils of socialism incarnated by the Soviet Union, produced in the context of the Spanish Civil War. 1949 is the document that most immediately concerns our discussion today, when the Holy Office is the successor institution to the Inquisition, long-term successor institution to the Inquisition. The Holy Office in 1949 issued a decree on communism, and I'll quote, come back to that in just a moment. Any Catholic faithful professing materialist and anti-Christian doctrine as communists, and above all those who defend or propagate such doctrine, incur as apostates to the faith, the excommunication specially reserved to the Holy See. Why is this problematic? Because you'll find that many of the publications that not only Mazowiecki, but many of his closest colleagues put forth in their first 15, 20 years of public activism, including that explanation that he gave in 1970, with which I began, actually argue that it is only the pursuit by Catholics in a socialist order of socialist revolution that can allow for the fulfillment of those different items that I was listing before. Cross-class solidarity. Here he mentions specifically personalism. Right? So 1950, Mazowiecki writes, "It is the complete development and integration of personalism into the content of the socialist revolution that ought to endow Catholic thought with the proper form. For it is the struggle for personalism in a socialist order that falls to us as Catholics." It's not just that he was making the best of a bad situation. When I should note, Mazowiecki at the time that he wrote this was 23 years old. Of course, we think of, I think back to things that I wrote when I was 23 years old. I would feel a little bit silly if someone 100 years from now were holding me to the letter of every single document produced at that age. But on the other hand, these are very, very serious tracts and very, very serious philosophical reflections that he was producing when he was in his early to mid-20s. So I think it actually bears some reflection. For example, at the age of 24, he was not just producing articles arguing for the Catholic socialist pursuit of personalism. He was actually working on a book, trying to lay out the design for how to harmonize Catholicism and Marxism within People's Poland. He got about 60 pages into the book, at which point it became clear that the publishing house that was to have published it, his movement's own, Pax, was not going to publish it. This has to do with his complicated relations with the head of the movement, to whom I'll return in a moment. But he had an agenda which was bearing fruit in the form of a fairly serious, systematically articulated philosophy. This didn't come out of nowhere. Mazowiecki could have invoked any number of, from today's standpoint, very prominent, even mainstream Catholic thinkers who in the 1930s and 1940s in Western Europe would have seemed completely out of left field and entirely unorthodox. Yves Congar, the great French Dominican theologian, was muzzled by Pius XII from the mid-1940s through the mid-1950s. Indeed, for the better part of the 1950s, he wasn't even allowed to teach. Which is bizarre when one thinks about the fact that he was one of the principal voices at the Second Vatican Council just a decade later. In the 1930s, he explained, in terms that Mazowiecki could invoke 20 years later, that actually the Catholic Church wasn't taking work seriously at all. If we only talk about Marxism and Bolshevism in Latin, Lenin can sleep peacefully in his Moscow mausoleum. The point being not that all Catholics should embrace socialism, but that Catholics should seriously examine and consider the letter of canonical socialist texts and think carefully in terms that go beyond a wholesale condemnation of what it was that socialism could bring to the table in the pursuit of social justice and cross-class solidarity. All right, that was my long introduction to the intellectual framework. I want to give a few details on Mazowiecki biographically before I consider his long-term trajectory. The photo here on the left is from his index, his student booklet or grade transcript from 1949. At the time, he was 22 years old. At that point, he had been politically active for 3 years. He had joined, the first political organization that Mazowiecki joined was the Polish Christian Democratic Party Stronnictwo Pracy in the summer of 1946. After about 2.5 months, the organization disintegrated in the town of Płock, really the city of Płock, from which Mazowiecki hailed. At that point, he had never actually left Płock, except for the surrounding countryside. It wasn't until he began his studies in Warsaw in the fall of 1946 at Warsaw University that he actually was exposed to a more national political agenda. By this point, however, he had been exposed to the writings, again, he's 19 years old at this point, the writings of prominent Catholic philosophers, particularly Jacques Maritain and Emmanuel Mounier. Mazowiecki did not know French. In principle, he learned some. In principle, he even delivered a few talks in French. Practice, he really never knew French. His first wife, who died of tuberculosis a year after their marriage, but whom he met when he was finishing high school after World War II, actually systematically translated for him from French into Polish extended passages of Maritain, Mounier, Congar, and other French-language Catholic writers. So it was actually through this very, very close personal relationship that Mazowiecki also developed an intimate and deeply emotional relationship with a lot of these writings that stood behind that word, personalism, that he used quite often. So, going back to these images here, when Mazowiecki at the age of 19 would have joined Stronnictwo Pracy, which was very briefly after World War II in Poland, headed by Karol Popiel, who's in the upper right here, who was briefly quite a figure in the London emigre scene after World War II, before he began bouncing around between New York, Rome, and Paris, running his own emigre political operations, a fascinating history of its own. But by the end of 1946, certainly by the elections of 1947, Popul's party had been gutted from the inside by individuals closely tied to the establishing communist regime. Mazowiecki, when the youth Stronnictwo Pracy circle disintegrated in Płock in late 46, went off to Warsaw, as I mentioned before. Inside of a year, he had been recruited to attend a youth camp organized by a movement that had been established in late 1945 called Dziś i Jutro, Today and Tomorrow. I'm sitting next to the the authoritative biographer of the gentleman in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, Bolesław Piasecki. So I'm not going to go into much detail about him, except to say that before World War II, he was a fascist. After World War II, he was a fascist. But he presented himself as the most Catholic, most socialist, potential Catholic socialist collaborator of the establishing communist regime. And it was his movement that Mazowiecki joined just before the end of 1947. By mid-1948, Mazowiecki had become one of the leading young figures of the movement. It's hard to establish a linear trajectory for him, and also to situate him generationally, because there were not many people in Mazowiecki's age group in the movement. The movement initially consisted mostly of ex-fascists who had known Piasecki either in the 30s or had joined him in World War II. But Mazowiecki's role was really, in a lot of ways, centered on publishing and recruitment. And it was in these years that he had the opportunity to develop his Catholic philosophy and to develop his future political agenda, really to go beyond what had sort of casually attracted him to Stronnictwo Pracy in 1946, to thinking about the relationship between the Catholic pursuit of social justice that had been on the table since the 1890s, if not earlier, arguably, and this new socialist regime that proclaimed to be pursuing social justice. This is how we can explain the paradox of Mazowiecki becoming intensely involved, and I think authentically and wholeheartedly so, in a self-styled Catholic socialist project at the heart of the Stalinist period in Poland. He never gave up, and I'll get to the popes here at the bottom of the screen in a second. He never would give up on the writings of Emmanuel Mounier, and he was particularly inspired by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and more generally, he read very ecumenically. German was his foreign language. That was the language in which he read, and the language in which he personally absorbed many ideas. But he tried to integrate different voices and create very ecumenical self-presentation of what it was that the Polish socialist regime could do for Catholicism. Indeed, how perhaps he and his fellow 20-somethings in the movement PAX in the early 1950s could form a new kind of Catholic vanguard in the context of Stalinist Poland. So he collected writings that had been published in Poland by folks translating Jacques Maritain in the 1930s. This is an example of a text published by Maritain in 1934 in the monthly journal Prąd, and fed them together with other texts published in Dziś i Jutro, the weekly, that Piasecki began publishing starting in 1945, connected to Emmanuel Mounier, the French Catholic philosopher's 3-week visit to Poland in May 1946, which stimulated a very vigorous discussion among Polish Catholic intellectuals in that year that followed for several years about the nature of Catholic engagement in Poland, self-styled as either maximalist or minimalist, the idea being, do we want to involve ourselves in public life, or do we simply want to survive and continue to articulate certain cultural and intellectual conceptions of what it means to be Catholic? And in the middle is the first page of the manuscript that he was preparing, that he never finished, about how to harmonize Catholicism and Marxism against the backdrop of the human person. Another angle that I think is useful for situating Mazowiecki's pursuits during these Stalinist years comes from Emmanuel Mounier's successor as editor-in-chief of Esprit, the French monthly journal, which continues to publish until this day, Jean-Marie Domenac, who would later become a very prominent European intellectual. In the early 1950s, actually in 1954, in 1 year, he went twice to Poland, the second time to receive the Włodzimierz Pietrzak Award, which is the Pax Movement's award, and it was a special incarnation created for international activities on behalf of the advancement of peace. And what Domenac said when he went to Warsaw was really emblematic of what he believed linked fundamentally the French and Polish Catholics together during the years of Stalinism. Action against Germany, and action to limit Germany, which is why this explains the kind of phrasing that he would have used here. When we are asked to mobilize Christian Europe against Bolshevism, we reply no. For we remain loyal to the cause for which we are fighting and loyal to the friends with whom we fight. Mazowiecki, 4 years later, would be corresponding with Domenac about the establishment of his own journal after 1956, after the start of de-Stalinization, in a completely different context. But the links forged across the Iron Curtain began during the Pax years, even for Mazowiecki, who actually did not travel across the Iron Curtain until 1957 for the first time. It's clear that this kind of thinking informed his early years. And one thing that I should say, and I think this is actually quite important for understanding the agenda point that would be crucial for him in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Polish-German reconciliation, is that early on, he was one of the loudest voices within Pax promoting the idea of Polish ressentiment reclaiming Poland's western lands. In fact, the reason why, and arguably, he was such a prominent activist in the first half of the 1950s within Pax is because he established and ran very effectively a weekly journal called the Wrocławski Tygodnik Katolicki, the Wrocław Catholic Weekly. And the goal of this was to emphasize the Polishness of Poland's western lands. I think this was very much in the back of his mind 20 years later when he began to meet figures like the West German Christian Democrat Richard von Weizsäcker, or get to know other Germans and establish a long-term agenda for what he considered Polish-German reconciliation. 1955, he leaves Pax. There's a big row for which I won't highlight the details, but actually the gist of it is that he and his fellow sort of young Turks, most active 20-something activists within Pax, came to the conclusion that Piasecki was not really a socialist at all, that he was really a fascist megalomaniac trying to get rich. They weren't wrong. So they actually left as a matter of principle. It was a little bit more complicated than that, and we can talk about the details more if you'd like in the discussion. For about a year, most of them are unemployed. In October of 1956, they become involved in the process of creating a new movement of Catholic intellectuals, the Catholic Intelligentsia Club movement, which really comes on the wave of de-Stalinization in Poland. It's here that you get Mazowiecki's integration with an older generation of Catholic activists, some of whose names are quite familiar, like Jerzy Turowicz, the founding co-editor of Tygodnik Powszechny, the Kraków-based weekly, which has appeared not quite continuously, but more or less with only brief periods of interruption since 1945, as well as various prominent Catholic activists and thinkers within Poland from Lublin, from Toruń, from Wrocław, and from Warsaw. And it's within the context of this movement that Mazowiecki very quickly takes himself from being someone who was simply reflecting on European Catholic thought to someone who is acting as a public activist in the name of this set of Catholic social teaching ideas on a European forum. 1957, he makes his first trip across the Iron Curtain. He goes to Vienna. 1958, he goes to Rome. By the mid-1960s, he has made several circuits around these cities. He, in 1963, goes to Brussels and meets for the first time an individual who would play an absolutely fundamental role in his life, the Catholic trade union leader Jan Kłakowski, who becomes one of his best friends and really whose friendship draws him in many ways into a very particular set of ideals that help to structure Mazowiecki's future thinking about solidarity once that option rolls around. You can see on the left here the passport application that Mazowiecki had to fill out in 1958 prior to his departure for Rome. Mazowiecki, in many ways, becomes one of the faces of the Catholic Intelligentsia Club movement, particularly after in 1961 he is elected to the Polish Communist Sejm as an MP. He has a diplomatic passport afterwards, and that doesn't necessarily mean that that travel is easy for him or that he has any money connected to travel, but what it does mean is that he carries a certain cachet when he travels, not just as a young firebrand thinker, but as someone who represents potentially a viable option. And it was that perception when he was traveling in Brussels or in Rome or in Paris in the 1950s and 1960s that really elevated him in many ways to a level that I think is quite remarkable for someone who at the time was still only 36 years old and really knew only one language besides Polish and had just a decade previously been arguing that is in the context of Stalinist Poland that Catholic Third Way should be fulfilled. One thing I should emphasize, I'm going to come back here to images of the popes at the bottom. In 1963, when he left for this meeting in Brussels in May of that year, Mazowiecki not only met Jan Kłakowski, he met Giorgio Lapida, the Christian Democratic mayor of Florence. He met August van Istendal, the head of the Christian trade unions, the Christian trade union movement that would become the World Confederation of Labor. He met a number of other prominent Catholic publicists and activists from all across Europe. In June of that year, he was in Paris when Pope John the 23rd died. John the 23rd was the Pope who had inaugurated this idea of aggiornamento, who had convoked the Second Vatican Council. Personally, Mazowiecki felt John the 23rd to be the single greatest thing that kept him attached to the Catholic Church, not just as a set of principles or a set of a philosophical ideal, but as a practical institution covering any number of people and organizational and organizations and goals. Mazowiecki actually attended John the 23rd's funeral. And I think this is a pivotal moment within his life. The fact that he happened to be abroad when John the 23rd died and was able to be in Rome in June 1963 when this, for him, iconic pope passed away. And he felt a personal connection with that atmosphere of aggiornamento that was layered on top of the earlier version of Catholic social teaching that he had been pursuing while in Pax and while co-founding the Catholic Intelligentsia Club. Right, moving along. Mazowiecki and a familiar figure here, of course, Professor Leszek Kołakowski, were born in the same year, 1927. In the mid-1960s, really in the early 1960s, the two facilitated, not directly, not one-on-one, but in terms of intersecting milieu, the creation of a dialogue between secular humanists and Catholic humanists within Poland. This is something that actually became one of the principal features of the journal Więź that Mazowiecki edited from 1958 until 1981. This idea of looking for a common field of dialogue. And in fact, Mazowiecki quite clearly, I'm going to quote him here briefly, articulated how he understood the dialogue that he was pursuing across the Catholic socialist divide. As a quote-unquote dialogue would be a method of coexistence that presupposes that both sides constantly act reciprocally upon one another instead of turning their backs on each other and closing themselves off, end quote. This would be the basis for systematic integration with a number of Kołakowski's most prominent PhD students, Mazowiecki's co-founder at Więź, Janusz Zabłocki, who would later become quite a prominent public Catholic activist in Poland in his own right, although going a separate path from Mazowiecki, actually was accepted by Kołakowski to write a PhD thesis on personalism. Zabłocki was elected to parliament, so he never actually wrote the thesis, but the dialogue and the foundation had already been set. And in many ways, it was through the ideas of Kołakowski and the shared intellectual and political space for dialogue that had been created in the early 60s between Kołakowski's students and the Więź staff I need to emphasize, it was during the years of Vatican II also, right? The idea being maybe an opening within Catholicism or an updating of Catholicism would also mean that finally this kind of cross-class solidarity could be fulfilled and extended to cross-political solidarity. That's the framing context, which is why I have a picture from the funeral of John the 23rd on the same slide as a photo of Leszek Kołakowski with Adam Michnik. It's through this sort of transition across the 1960s that Michnik and Mazowiecki first begin talking. They don't have serious conversations until the end of really until the 70s, until Michnik is out of prison following his leadership of the 1968 student protests. But the groundwork had been laid. Michnik had come to many Więź meetings already as a high schooler, actually. Michnik had even been to Rome during the sessions of the Second Vatican Council. It's fascinating to think about the number of interstices within which the contacts between the Poles and between the Poles and other nationalities fell within self-styled Catholic realm and across the divide between Catholics and socialists. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here because I only have about 5 minutes remaining. But I want to explain the intellectual trajectory that takes us within Mazowiecki's career from the late 1960s up until Solidarity. Mazowiecki left the Polish Parliament in 1972 after he had been calling for an investigation into the events in Gdańsk in December of 1970. He was not prohibited from running again for Parliament. Over the course of the next few years, he really threw himself back into his editing. In 1969, his mentor, Jerzy Zawiejski, his mentor within the Catholic Intelligentsia Club movement, had died under suspicious circumstances at best. A year later, Mazowiecki's second wife died. His wives died of natural causes. This one left him with three young sons. So Mazowiecki, for the first half of the 1970s, it's important to understand, was juggling very much a new set of personal obligations with a new political context within which he was trying to understand himself. But in the wake of the Helsinki Agreement of 1975, it becomes clear that his writings shift toward a harmonization of the idea of personalism he had been pursuing for 20 years, with, actually more than 20 years, by that time almost 30 years, with this vocabulary of human rights that had come out of Helsinki, which explains how by 1977 we see him as the spokesman for a hunger strike movement within the Church of St. Martin, Kościół Świętego Marcina, in Warsaw, in protest against the treatment of members of the Committee for the Defense of Workers, called, and also why he is organizing a conference in 1977 in the Warsaw Catholic Intelligentsia Clubs on human rights, and explaining himself here in terms that for him were closely linked to the philosophy of personalism within which he had seen himself for years. Very quickly. As far as I'm concerned, Solidarity in many ways is both the apotheosis and the key turning point for Mazowiecki's self-understanding as a Catholic Third Way activist. For him, there had been a consistent trajectory, even though through different political context and through occasionally very problematic associations, toward the pursuit of Catholic-inspired social justice, whether in cooperation with the socialist regime, in dialogue with the students of Leszek Kołakowski, or on the international forum, whether in the 60s in Brussels, in Rome, or in the 70s in the context of the Helsinki movement. 1980, all of this comes to a head. He's one of the people preparing the 21 points in Gdańsk. He's in Gdańsk in August of 1980, and he becomes sort of an iconic figure of the backdrop, the intellectual backdrop behind Wałęsa. For Mazowiecki, Solidarity I think it's important to sort of check this idea that Solidarity had in some ways overcome for him his earlier pursuit of a Catholic Third Way. In some ways, Solidarity for him was the embodiment of a Catholic Third Way. It had just enough socialism to give him the sense that there had been a learning process, that there had been a trajectory that had acquired a lot of the features and learned from a lot of the mistakes of the socialist regimes, while at the same time having a distinctly Christian character, if not even talking about the iconography of the Black Madonna or the involvement of priests in the Catholic Church institutionally in solidarity. And I think what's more, Mazowiecki believed that the September 1981 encyclical that John Paul II issued, which very clearly lauded solidarity as a model for Catholic engagement on behalf of social justice in the world, he believed that this was in some sense confirming his own understanding of solidarity's importance. In order to achieve social justice in the various parts of the world, in the various countries, there's a need for ever new movements of solidarity of the workers and with the workers. This solidarity must be present whenever it is called for by the social degrading of the subject of work, by exploitation of the workers, and by the growing areas of poverty and even hunger. Now, I should say that by this time, the Church had in some ways moved toward a new version of the social question. After Vatican II, the Vatican and the Catholic Church writ large globally is moving toward understanding the social question as a problem of international development, as a problem conditioned by decolonization, motivated toward the global South. John Paul II, where his unique genius in terms of understanding the social question was in bringing together the old version of the social question, Europe's industrial proletariat, with the new globalizing version of the social question. And for John Paul II, as for Mazowiecki's own self-understanding, solidarity, the movement that emerged in 80-81, was the linchpin for linking the two. Problem is, solidarity is suppressed at the end of 1981. Mazowiecki has the sense that actually there are forces internal to the way that solidarity was created that both made it the apotheosis of this movement toward a Catholic third way and demonstrated the lack of a sustainable agenda for that third way. So he spends a good part of the 1980s wrestling with his inner demons and thinking about what exactly he can do next. In 1989, he becomes Prime Minister of Poland in late August. And we have a new vocabulary that comes in. And I think that this is extraordinarily telling. This is actually the reason why I even first decided to think about writing a biography of Mazowiecki, trying to understand how we jump from 4 decades worth of activism on behalf of Catholic social justice to this declaration at the beginning, which suggests that rather than thinking about his own experience, he's looking to the dilemmas faced by Konrad Adenauer in 1949. I'm looking for my Erhard, giving up on the Catholic alternative in some sense in favor of the plan pursued by Leszek Balcerowicz. And this is whatever we actually say about Balcerowicz's plan, it's a departure. It's a fundamental departure from the trajectory pursued earlier. When I've given other versions of this presentation elsewhere, I've always been asked in Q&A, aren't you being a little generous to Mazowiecki? The social market economy introduced by Adenauer and Erhard was actually much kinder to society than the reforms introduced by Balcerowicz. I'm not an economist. I think that sounds actually quite convincing on some level, but if it's true, then it in some sense reinforces all the more the drastic nature of the departure that Mazowiecki makes. And it's in the context of the Balcerowicz reforms and the shift taken by Mazowiecki away from any kind of an identification with a Catholic political and social agenda that we understand that earlier statement. I'm a Christian and I'm a Democrat, but I'm not a Christian Democrat. That he felt himself in no way beholden to legacies of political Catholicism, whether understood in a Polish context or in a more European or global context. And this is where Mazowiecki was willing to cooperate with Kohl, he was willing to negotiate with Kohl, but he absolutely did not want to place himself within any larger framework of Catholic politics, including that third way option that he had been pursuing for so long. If I can add just a very brief epilogue by way of conclusion. One of Mazowiecki, after 1989, was best known, among other things, as the special rapporteur for the former Yugoslav countries who in 1995 resigned in protest against the UN's failure do anything to prevent, or subsequently really to learn, demonstrate that it had learned its lessons from the Srebrenica massacre. And in a lot of ways, I think that the language that he used in his reports, specifically language of pursuing confessional pluralism and arguing that the conflict in the former Yugoslav countries was not a holy war, that takes us back to a lot of the ideas that Mazowiecki had been interested in pursuing throughout his earlier career, but had receded into the backdrop in 1989. Now we can discuss, and I'm not going to do it now because I'm past the end of my time, also his role in formulating the Polish constitution in the 1990s and in dictating, in some sense, the tone of political discourse in Poland in the 1990s. For example, why religion was introduced into state schools at all in Poland. But that's a bit of a separate conversation. I think I hope that I've made the point that 1989 was in many ways a departure from what I otherwise see as a fairly steady trajectory by Mazowiecki, but the elements that he pursued throughout his entire life were visible until the end. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you.